Part 2. And the bridge was suspended between the two eternities, arched so high up there that the watchman could from his tower see all that had gone before and all that was to come. And that is why the anxious, helpless peoples of this crazy world continue to look up in despair and cry, "O watchman, tell us in this endless night just what the signs of promise are." Chapter 12. A View from the Bridge. The summing up. This has been an interpretation of history. I have swept across over 6,000 years with the story of the African people, touching here and there on prehistoric. Footnote: prehistory is another improper term we are stuck with. Its very origin reflects the self-glorification of those who had learned to write, the written records becoming sacred and the principal source of truth. There is actually no such thing as prehistory. Man was leaving historical records millions of years before he began to write them. End of footnote. Beginnings, such as at Wose, and selectively spotlighting the blackout areas in that history in my broad sweep through the millenniums. My own field studies in just about every region on the continent, and my interpretation even of the data of many of the scholars appearing in the bibliography, often led to quite different conclusions than theirs. Indeed, these modern Westerners either ignore or contradict some of the best evidence of the ancient writers on Africa. The conflict of viewpoints on the history of the African people develops as issues in the work, and I suppose that at the present level of civilization, such a conflict should be expected between those who represent the masters of the globe and those who are in rebellion against them. As the writers of the history of the people they oppress, invariably there is a deeply felt need to present the dominated people as childlike creatures, inferior by an ordinance of nature, and therefore helpless without the permanent rule and guiding hand of the master race. Perhaps the highlights in the history of the blacks, which is all this work claims to be, would be even more clearly understood if I had written backwards, beginning with the present. For one thing, less documentation would be required, for by focusing on predominantly black South Africa, Rhodesia, and the present-day Sudan, the whole world could see, almost at a glance, exactly what happened to black Egypt many centuries ago. The script of the play, whites against blacks, is the same. The eternal drive glorifying white blood is the same, finding direct expression in all Caucasian-controlled social and economic systems. In South Africa, the Dutch offsprings by black women are classified coloreds and ranked as a separate ethnic group below the Dutch in social and economic status, but far above the Africans. In Egypt, the coloreds gradually became the majority, as more and more whites came in, and more blacks moved southward. The name Egyptian was taken over by the whites and the northern coloreds as applying to themselves alone. The blacks, who were the original Egyptians, were no longer called Egyptians, just as the blacks in South Africa today are no longer called South Africans. Only the whites are South Africans. Both in Egypt and South Africa, the scheme was to make the mulattoes a separate ethnic group, superior to the blacks because of Caucasian blood, thus creating mutual hatreds that would make unity difficult if not impossible. By giving all mulattoes privileges and opportunities denied to blacks, the scheme worked not only in South Africa and ancient Egypt, but it was successful throughout the world and still operates in the 1970s. The white man has every reason to proudly view his handiwork in managing people and pronounce it good. In the Sudan, the white Arabs were so successful that their coloreds there consider themselves Arabs, not Africans, and look down contemptuously on the blacks in the southern Sudan, exactly the same as the Egyptian coloreds regarded this same once all-black region, Ethiopia, centuries ago. The picture in the northern Sudan today then is exactly the same as the picture was in northern Ethiopia, Egypt, after it became predominantly Afro-Asian and Afro-European. And the picture in the southern Sudan today is the same all-black picture southern Ethiopia, the Sudan itself, presented over 2,000 years ago. And just as their ancient forefathers battled then against the Egyptian coloreds, the blacks in the southern Sudan, at the very hour these lines were being written, were still arrayed in battle against the Arabs, now predominantly colored, and for the same ancient reasons. Does anyone wonder why this all-important white-created color factor is skipped over by white historians? If they were scientific in their approach and objective in their methods, they would deal with the mulatto role in black history, even though it was a major source of white power and the white man's most effective agent in helping to destroy black civilizations everywhere they found. White historians would really grow in stature if they themselves wrote the story, wrote it as it was. This will never happen, of course, for they would be recording how the increased number of coloreds after each white invasion made it easy to credit them with all the great advances the blacks themselves had made. They, the white writers, would be telling how these half-blacks came to be classified as Caucasoids, and how helpful this was in obliterating black Egypt from the pages of history. By this master stroke, through their own sexual creations, they were able to erase the blacks as the first builders of a great civilization and deliberately rob them of that honor. The long drawn-out process by which all this was accomplished has been detailed in this work. It had to be dealt with along with other factors and forces, because the inferior status of black people throughout the world today tends to confirm the white man's doctrine that they are inferior in fact. His whole system, universally applied, was designed to make them inferior and keep them so. Who then in the 20th century would believe that these same blacks were of the race that had built great cities, developed writing, the arts and sciences, when the whites of Europe were still roaming tribes of barbarian warriors? This being a well-known, though not publicized, fact of history, how then explain the descent of the blacks from the heights reached by their forefathers to the depths in which they find themselves today? This was the central question in all of our research. Most of the important answers are given in preceding chapters. Future research, especially field research, will reveal an even more amazing story. A study of the general history of mankind reveals no people who have suffered so much in every area of life and survived. One thinks immediately of the Jews and the systematic oppression they encountered in every land. But they were not enslaved, not since the days when whites were generally enslaved everywhere, and slavery had nothing to do with race. We have seen that after the murderous revolt of white slaves in the 13th century, white slavery ended, and thereafter the concentration was on blacks alone. The Jews, being white and tenaciously clinging to their own heritage, were able to find escape routes not open to blacks anywhere: business, finance, and science. They were free to study, and study they did, surpassing almost all other peoples in the resulting intellectual supremacy. Learning became a second religion. They had seen that two of the certain ways to overcome their oppressors were the mastery of wealth and intellectual excellence. They therefore became moneylenders to emperors, kings, and popes. Meanwhile, the blacks were still being hunted down and enslaved, and when freed, they were kept as close to the status of slaves as such efforts could achieve. Yet today we are just beginning to learn about the heights from which they were driven. One of the highly important things this study revealed was how the very color of black came to mean slave, and therefore equated with bad luck, inferiority, and shame. We have dared to go beyond the limits and the guidelines set for us by the czars of history and geography to discover that ancient Ethiopia covered North Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, that Egypt was the northeastern division of that empire, and that even as late as 3100 BC, when white Asians held Lower Egypt, Ethiopians still held most of their homeland in Upper Egypt. In short, almost all of Egypt was black as late as 3100 BC. I say as late as 3100 BC to emphasize the fact again that all this is well known to white historians concerned with Africa. They know because when the earliest Greek and Roman writers studied in the land, Egypt was still black. They knew what the history was, and they left the records. Even when Herodotus arrived, black civilization was known to be so ancient that its beginning was lost in a distant past beyond memory. But when he arrived, he found a very mixed Egyptian population of whites, browns, yellows, and blacks. The first three groups now drawing a line between themselves as Egyptians, while giving to the blacks the lowest class status along with the original name of Ethiopians. Original as Greek term. There may have been some justice in this when Herodotus was in Egypt. The masses of non-integrating blacks had themselves rejected both Egypt and the Egyptian names as the Asians and Afro-Asians became the majority, and they had concentrated below a new borderline as Ethiopians in an Ethiopian empire that no longer included Egypt. The most important fact here is that the Greeks were the first Europeans to know that the most advanced civilization of the ancient world was in Africa. The first Europeans to study and be directly influenced by it, and to proclaim it to the world boldly and without reservations. Indeed, it is from Greek history, including their myths and legends, that we get some of the best insights into the early history of the blacks. They drew upon the land of the blacks for architectural designs, city planning, sculpture, science, and even religion. These they reshaped and made Greek. The Greeks were the best traveling students in the world. In their relations with Africa, they exemplified, as no other people had, the eclectic process of civilization and progress. The readiness to borrow from other peoples the best in their culture, to be reshaped or made over to suit one's own ideals and needs. Having lost most of our own written records through both destruction, endless displacement, and the gradual loss of African scribes, the black world owes the debt of everlasting thanks to those early Greek and Roman writers, but mostly Greek, who included much of our ancient history with their own and passed it down through the centuries. We salute them. The early disruption of African civilization, as we have seen, was followed by a long series of absolute blockades to progress. These included the combined forces of nature, ever-expanding deserts, scarcity of water, hostile climate, and the ravages of disease arising largely from conditions of famine. And yet, while the primary causes of disaster had set in motion the dispersions of people from the earliest times, searching for survival sites, through it, all kingdoms and empires were built, destroyed, and built again. These were the slow-moving, voluntary migrations from which so many of the small and large cities developed with different languages and dialects. The invaders raiding into the continent from Asia and Europe formed the second centuries-long battlefronts against which the blacks had to fight for survival. These wars spanned several thousand years, and in an earlier chapter I wondered out loud, and still wonder, how any people, weakened by perpetual hunger and disease, could possibly carry on wars of resistance to the white invaders for over 5,000 years. This they did, and this their descendants must know and remember with pride, that black resistance to white domination covered over 5,000 years. When the enslavers pressed in upon them from the north, from the east, from the west, and from the south, they continued to fight. The resistance to slavery continued while the continent was being depopulated by it, with the active participation of many black chiefs and kings, seeking wealth and the white man's promise of security from all of their black foes. The third battle lines for survival were, therefore, internal, and points up one of the main contributions they made toward their domination by other peoples. As time went on, they became so preoccupied with warring against each other that they seemed to regard the whites as friends by comparison. This seeming contradiction is baffling, for while there is nothing new about a people fighting among themselves, they generally stop if outsiders attack, forget their differences, and join united ranks against the common foe. Caucasians will wage frightful wars against other Caucasians, but will quickly unite, as though by instinct, against non-whites, not only in wars but in international policies. They have developed a kind of built-in solidarity in their relations with non-Caucasian peoples. This fact, as much as anything else, helped to explain their position as masters of the world. On the other hand, and in glaring contrast, disunity and non-cooperation have been characteristic of black societies, and this fact, more than anything else, helps in the understanding not only of why the blacks eventually lost in their battles against the whites, but also why even today they are still unable to deal with the white world. This situation of antagonism, self-hatred, and attending disunity in the race is a matter of such grave concern that I have returned to it again and again throughout these discussions. The only reason for dealing with the role played by the mulattoes in black history, for example, was to show how baffling and complex the problem is. For they were used not only to help disguise the most significant achievements of blacks, but they were also effectively used to further enhance and perpetuate the already existing conflicts and divisions among them. Now they had just as much right to be classified as white as they did to be classified as black. But they found it expedient to operate in both worlds, exploiting the blacks while serving the interests of the whites. There could never be any clear-cut judgment or defense against internal subversion along any color line, because in almost every black society it was possible to find some mulattoes who were as loyal to the race as any could be, and some blackest of the blacks who might be paid agents of the Arabs or Europeans. The state of black Africa, then, was a state of perpetual fears of being hunted down and attacked from without, fears of betrayals by unknown followers from within, fears of attacks by other migrating blacks who were themselves fleeing from danger, fears of hunger, ever-mounting disease, and of the alarming number of deaths that could never become common, no matter how often they occurred. Fears of all kinds, another source of mutual suspicions and distrusts. Centuries of this, and the amazing outcome: the blacks became their own worst enemies, and therefore increasingly a helpless people. The migrations were the moving phenomena in this tragedy. For while we have seen that many of them ended with the rebirth of new states from one end of the continent to the other, states that stood until Arabs and Europeans delivered the final death blows, millions of other blacks were unable to achieve this temporary glory. These were the Africans whose daily task was sheer survival, nothing less, nothing more. Every one of their communities had 4 to 6 months of each year which everyone knew as starving times, the period when children ate dirt and the bark from trees, when it was a great occasion if food enough could be found for 2 or 3 meals a week, when to find a water hole or a little stream that had not completely dried up was even more joyful than finding something to eat, and a time when some mothers would steal away into the bush with their little skeleton-like children with swollen bellies to die quietly in the shade. This was starving times. During this awful period of hell on earth, even the better-off cattle-raising groups outside of the tsetse-fly regions suffered great losses in herds as they wandered far and wide in the frantic search for unparched grassland and water. In none of this we are dealing with the merely unusual misfortunes which are occasionally visited upon almost every people. No, we are dealing here with the unusual, something quite different in the general experience of mankind. For we are reviewing here a permanent situation which, in combination with the forces outlined in foregoing pages, destroyed the civilization of an entire race, checked progress, and forced countless thousands into barbarism. These were the people who sought freedom and security in the forests, swamps, and caves. Some, unable to advance under these conditions, nevertheless battled against sinking to the level of savages. Some rebuilt their states even in the vast forests, and still others, famine-crazed, became savages or semi-barbarians. Many of the groups that descended to this lowest state of existence were isolated in areas where starving times was not a period of months, but of years. The worst outcome from the forced migrations all over Africa in the long search for places of refuge and freedom were the endless splintering off of societies into countless little isolated states. Overall, it is difficult to see how it could have been otherwise. They had to split up. Unity in terms of keeping a very large group together was impossible. Seldom could 10,000 people move en masse, not to mention 100,000. And 100,000 would be a small number if it was a great state that was being disorganized and destroyed. If they were being attacked by invaders, not only expediency but life itself dictated that they split up into small groups, each under an elected leader. In this way, both the chances of escape from the enemy and of finding food and water somewhere were better than would be the case if they moved in one vast body. Some of these separated groups did indeed meet again by chance before they had become total strangers to each other. These often settled in the same general region and near enough to each other to maintain the same language. Others met again generations after the original segmentations, met as strangers speaking in different tongues and with different patterns of culture. Strangers, yet all descendants from the same society. Worse still, the blacks have been so busy being different through all these years that they have been unable to see that underlying all of their cultural varieties is the compelling evidence that they are all members of the same race and have the same common origin. And this is the best and most remarkable outcome of the migrations, with their fragmentations, disunities, and interminable turmoil and crises, that they held on, tenaciously held on, to the fundamentals of the same constitutional principles, the same democratic and political systems, and the same social institutions, maintained from one end of Africa to the other, just as though they were still members of one and the same vast African society. This fact was immediately reflected in the institutions and the political structure of every new state that emerged during all those centuries of migrations. Just as the council told Ethiopian kings what they could and could not do, the same remained true throughout the continent where black rule prevailed according to tradition. This was why 3,000 years later, and 3,000 miles farther south, a Shaka could complain bitterly because the Zulu council of yes-men failed to check him in his excesses. Finding himself an absolute autocrat, he was surprised to find that he had been allowed to get away with it. A view from the bridge. What then is the view from the bridge? The outlook is grim. For the black people of the world, there is no bright tomorrow. The blacks may continue to live in their dream world of singing, dancing, marching, praying, and hoping because of the deluding signs of what looks like victories, still trusting in the ultimate justice of the white man. But 1,000 years hence, their descendants will be substantially where the race was 1,000 years before. For the white people, still masters of the world, do not have to yield. They have never changed their real attitude toward black people during all the passing centuries, and there is absolutely nothing upon which to base the belief that they will change in the centuries to come. Concessions on some demands, yes. Expediency dictates this, noting that the black masses accept as leaders any and all Negroes who hold important positions. The whites who control these positions, directly or indirectly, actually determine who the leaders of blacks shall be as independent black organizations emerge. The dangling attractions of government and foundation grants are there to quiet the outspoken but money-hungry leaders. Indeed, some of these leaders were quick in discovering that the most certain route to a handsome grant or loan is pretended outrage and shouting militancy. The whites know this all too well. They are quite willing to pour millions of dollars into all kinds of black community projects precisely because they know that these phony leaders will do nothing that will really improve the conditions under which the black masses live. Blacks are still hopelessly naive if they do not yet understand that the whites never did and do not now intend to include blacks in the doctrine of human equality, equal justice, or anything else that means real equality. The white determination to keep blacks in an inferior position is so deep that they will battle against the enactment of civil rights laws even when they know there will be no real enforcement. The opposition is to the very idea of equality. Those Negroes who are so frantically fighting to escape from the African race by way of integration and amalgamation will continue to meet everlasting and universal opposition from the whites. The Negro drive to be with whites in every situation is equaled by the white determination to prevent it. Yet the whites must truly feel a deep sense of pride in seeing this Negro leadership so clearly validating their own belief in white superiority. Their pretended quality education objective actually collapses under the wheels of buses for racial balance. They are proclaiming to all the world that, regardless of general desegregation in any all-black or predominantly black population, the blacks themselves are utterly incapable of achieving or maintaining high standards of excellence in education or indeed anything else. Here we have, within the race, the intolerable situation of an anti-black group proclaiming the race's inherent inferiority more effectively than the whites ever could, precisely because this group is regarded as quote-unquote black. Furthermore, and even of greater importance, the amalgamationist Negroes generally hold most of the administrative and key teaching posts in the educational system. Through sheer indifference, therefore, they can block the development of the quality education in black schools while at the same time sending their own children to white private schools. Their remaining interest in the black schools is the money derived from their supervisory and teaching positions. Meanwhile, black students in the so-called integrated schools and colleges throughout the United States continue to tell the world that they are as segregated within as they were without. Far from being accepted, daily insults of various kinds occur inside the classrooms, in the halls, and on the outside. When fights break out, as they inevitably do, and the police are called in, they generally arrest the black students, not the white students, no matter who started the trouble. A press report, September 15th, 1972, simply read, quote, "During the recess hour, a black male student was called an offensive name by two white boys and pushed against the wall. A general fight broke out between black and white students. Police were called. 13 black students were arrested and jailed." End quote. Now, of course, all this is public information and is news to no one. But some of the salient facts that seem to stand out clearly are as follows. 1. White America is definitely and unalterably opposed to the integration and amalgamation of the two races. 2. Black America, the masses, are equally opposed to the integration and amalgamation of the races. 3. The drive for more and more amalgamation is and always has been spearheaded by those coloreds who maintain a separatist society within the black race, and who are not, and never have been, identified with the black masses. 4. Since everybody knows that there are millions of light-skinned members of the race, some as white as any Caucasian, who are as African in spirit and are as devoted to the race as anyone else, the crucial question is how long will this other white-oriented group be allowed to block the real progress of the race? 5. Those who seek and hope for admittance into white society should not be criticized or condemned. As previously stated, it is an individual matter of choice, and it is both natural and right if their blood call is to the white race rather than to the black. But they cannot be allowed to use their imposed leadership positions to browbeat all black Americans into the line of march into white society per se, and thus toward the ultimate extinction of blacks as such in this country. It is along this line against their benign genocide that the real battle for survival as a distinct people must be fought. 6. The drive for integration is most damnable on one score alone. It is a deliberate and stepped-up attack on the most significant aspects of the black revolution of the 60s. That revolt was the reversal in the psychology of the race, a quest for its lost manhood by first emancipating the mind from the bondage of over-Caucasianization, and to establish forever the real basis for equality with the rest of mankind from the rediscovered pages of a history that was supposed to be lost because it reveals a long line of giants unsurpassed by any people on earth. The Negro integrationalists are hostile to the black revolution and aim to defeat its main aims by forcing the black children and youth of the nation more directly under white education. Once again, as in slavery, they will be cut off not only from the history of their race, but they will also be cut off from a knowledge of all the other fields in which blacks have excelled, and from which comes the inspiration to, quote unquote, go forth and do likewise. The great mental revolution among the blacks that eventuates in more and more self-respect, a new sense of manhood and self-worth, all this alarms the Negro integrationalists, and they are resolved to defeat it by keeping the blacks firmly under the mind control of white institutions. 7. They are absolutely right about the general lack of quality education in black schools, the very schools in which they are the principal supervisors and teachers, but their minds and interests are elsewhere. Ghetto children are unteachable, they assure themselves, and they and their equally misguided principals and teachers of all kinds will fight to the death a Clark or any other plan that is expressly designed to improve the teaching and learning processes in black schools. They fear the idea of community control because it presents the possibility that irate parents might demand the removal of the merely job-holding and indifferent principals and teachers. 8. The millions of Africans of mixed blood who have always been steadfast and devoted to the race know that when the white man gives them a preferential status above the unmixed but always below himself, he does so to maintain the myth of superior white blood. Their redemption from the sin of African blood is proportionate to the amount of white blood in their veins. Indeed, if one is light enough or near white, he may even be appointed secretary of a department of the U.S. government and a member of the president's cabinet, and still not equal. Furthermore, white America has found that their purposes were served best by classifying as Negro all persons with any amount of African blood, no matter how small. This obvious injustice has never been openly challenged, even by those directly affected, and bitterly resent being so classified. But the United States refused to follow either the South African system of making their Afro-Dutch offsprings a separate ethnic group by law and calling them coloreds, or the ancient practice of Egypt and the Arab world of classifying mixed breeds as white. This fact has had a tremendous impact on integrationalist Negroes in the United States, leading many to identify with the Arab world rather than Africa, and even to adopt Arab names rather than African names. In fact, because of their powerful hold on Africa through the religion of Islam and the vast colored population in many Arab states, many white Arabs will publicly state, for African ears, that they are a non-white people. However, even if the United States did attempt to reclassify this group as either white or colored, the millions who are bound to the African race by unbreakable ties of love would fight such a move to its death. These have no desire to be either white or colored. For like the late Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who could have passed for white anywhere in the world, they would say, "Call me black," knowing full well that black refers not to anyone's color, for which none is responsible, but black defines one's attitude towards the homeland of his ancestors, which from times immemorial was called the land of the blacks. So something different developed in black America, for whereas in most other parts of the world the mulattoes form an elite caste, this is true only of certain groups in the United States, such as the Wezats of Maryland and Virginia, also known by other names, and their spillover in Washington, D.C. In general, the divided loyalties split them as anti-African and pro-African, which is the way it always has been. The view from the bridge thus far has been a refocus on the futility of our continuing and childlike faith in the white man's justice, the belief that our protests, marching demonstrations, singing and praying will change his 6,000 years of hostility to us, and that the Negroes who frantically battle for admission to white suburbia and to its private clubs, golf courses, swimming pools, etc., will never be welcomed, even though they may be near white in color. The final focal point in this connection is that the masses, from the blackest of the blacks to the lightest of the lights, do not care at all about socially mixing with the whites. They, the whites on their part, have no reason or inclination to do more than make token concessions from time to time, thus quieting noisy leaders, but never changing the inferior situation of the masses. They still own and control the wealth of Africa, directly and indirectly, and from it, along with that from other areas of the world, they have developed technologies and a world commerce, all fully protected by governments also under their control, that assure them of continued white supremacy. This phenomenal success, this unquestionable position of strength, derived from their conquest of other peoples and their wealth, has led them to believe that they are, as a matter of fact, the superior people and therefore the rightful rulers of this planet. Why, then, should they be expected to yield? Human rights? Equal justice? What are these but narcotic slogans for the masses, even the white masses, which are quickly conceded as ideals and principles everywhere? The masses of poor whites also live on these slogans and ideals of equal justice. They are a pitiful people, often half-starved themselves, yet living and having their being in the happy thought that they are members of the white conquering race, and that the once enslaved blacks among them are living evidence of their own superiority. They enjoy the glory reflected from the domination and the power achieved by the ruling minority of their race, too ignorant to realize that they are used as the tools of hate to support the wealth and power concentrated in relatively few hands. When these poor whites secure the kind of jobs that move them up in the glory land called middle class, they get the most concrete evidence of their innate superiority. They find that the economic system is so structured that, 1, to secure better jobs and advancement, the number one qualification is to be white. 2, that even where only a token number of non-whites are employed, they may be required to have college degrees, and sometimes the masters, while the higher salaried whites, including the supervisors, may not have a high school education. These are not merely may and may not theories. In the United States, the official statistics show that nationwide, black college graduates not only earn $1,040 a year less than white high school graduates, but they earn less than a white 10th grader. The white college graduate averages $3,095 more than the black college graduate. 3. Blacks must pay more to live than whites. The lower wages they receive and the higher prices they must pay are built-in guarantees that they will always occupy an inferior place in the society. Merchants now generally have 2 prices for the same goods, one black and one white. With the uneducated blacks, they are having a field day. They are equally successful in robbing the educated black middle class because of its abiding faith and status-striving complex. These are the Negroes who readily pay $225 a month for a house just vacated by whites who rented it for $125. And Negroes who buy $25,000 homes listed to whites for from $5,000 to $10,000 less, provided, of course, that white folks previously lived there. And the inner city food markets charge higher prices for cheaper brands of canned goods, and equally high prices for leftovers from their first-class stores in surrounding white suburbia. And 4. The insurance companies face this economic war on the blacks boldly and actuarially. They simply charge blacks more for less benefits. Blacks must pay higher premiums than whites for life insurance, for example, because it has been determined that their life expectancy is 10 years less than that of whites. For the insurance industry, it is strictly a matter of business. They know that the total economic system is so structured against the blacks that it is impossible for them to maintain proper health standards. Being black, they must die first, by 10 years. All this gives comfort and assurance to the poor, and once poor, silent majority. They feel that they have every reason to be silent. For does not this silent and secret war against the blacks, carried on every hour of their existence and deeply structured in the very fabric of national life, public and private, does this not reassure them every day that they are indeed members of the supreme ruling race? The view from the bridge had to focus first on the United States, because so much points to this land as the place where the first major racial explosion is likely to occur. One would think that South Africa and Rhodesia feel more secure with huge American investments and military backing than America itself is. A view of the motherland. This brings us to the main reason for the focus on America. It quickly assumed the role of the whole white West as the various powers were forced from their imperial rule in Asia and Africa. Forced, that is to say, from direct political rule or the political functions of colonialism. The world at large, in the greatest misconception of modern times, took this to mean African independence at last, African freedom, and the end of European colonialism. The plain truth is that the African states today are not even half free or independent, for colonialism was from the beginning exactly what it is today, an economic system for the control and exploitation of the wealth of other peoples. It was and it is a private enterprise system. Colonial government was initially company government. When the political task got too big because of the increasing rivalries between the great powers, the mother countries would appoint colonial governors and other administrators. In other words, government by the home country came in as a protecting umbrella for the main objective, economic exploitation. That economic control still prevails all over Africa. It is not neo-colonialism, but the old colonialism itself, still carrying on under the beautiful and high-flying flags of quote-unquote independent African nations. The various mineral resources are so vast and involve so many billions of dollars that individual Africans, called upon to decide whom they will serve, their people or the masters of the country's wealth, often decide to serve the latter. The fact that Africa is still in economic bondage to her former political masters brings us back to our point of departure. As the more political colonialism disappeared, the United States rushed in to fill the breach, to take up the banner as the quote-unquote leader of the free world, the Atlantic or Western powers, and hold the line of white supremacy throughout the world. The American military bases scattered all over the world have meaning far beyond any supposed communist threat. Rich European nations no longer need to maintain their usual armies for defense, for their great white brother, Uncle Sam, will gladly draft men to keep American forces there. American armed might is everywhere, ready to rush in to play the self-assigned role. This new world mission of the United States replaces, as far as it can, the more direct rule of the Western powers over the non-white peoples, the threat to black Africa and black people everywhere should be obvious. From the very beginning, for example, the American secret policy was to give little or no assistance to Africa. Outright grants, such as the billions poured into Europe, were never expected by the black nations. The Africans had sense enough to know that such free gifts were for whites only, but they did expect to secure loans on reasonable terms of repayment. The American attitude on loans to African states turned out to be about the same as it would have been if they had been begging for free grants. There was a very definite African policy, however. The policy was not to announce the policy. There was a public announcement of what was intended as a policy early in the 1960s. It said to Africa, in effect, that the United States would continue its friendly interest and, as always, said little or nothing in the matter of loans. Other friendly advice included the well-known information that they could apply to the World Bank. The big American air and military base in Ethiopia made it a favored African state like Libya. American investments in two other African states enabled them to secure loans. Black nations that might overcome the foreign economic stranglehold within their countries by increased production and exports for foreign exchange find their export trade blocked by the tariff walls of the same United States and the same European powers whose industrial machines would be crippled without the wealth, mineral resources, and basic strategic materials they still control and ship out of Africa. In a word, the blacks neither own nor control the wealth of their own land. Supposedly free again, they are unable to rebuild even as well as their migrating forefathers did before the Arab and European conquest. As shown in previous chapters, freed of the white man's control, a control from which most of them were fleeing, they were overriding all obstacles and successfully building and rebuilding new states until they were finally overtaken in the 19th and as late as the beginning of the 20th century. The overall view from the bridge, then, is simply the view of where and how the black people of the world stand today, after a summary review of at least 6,000 years of their history, and whether the focus is on Africa, the Caribbeans, the Americas, or elsewhere, they are now seen standing at the crossroads of history and confused. Out of the stormy past till we now stand at last. Where? Chapter 13. The Black World at the Crossroads. One of the most troublesome facts in the study of history over very long periods of time, such as several centuries, is that a truth may slowly emerge, period after period, until it clearly forms itself into a truth impregnable, a fact nowhere explicitly stated as such in the mass of data covered. As one continues to move on down through the centuries, countless events and situations may continue to make supporting additions to what has already been established as an unassailable fact. Yet that truth may be so repugnant, so utterly void of any rational or intelligent reason for its existence, that hardly any historian would wish to state it in his work. Yet I did just that when I wrote that, quote, "The whites are the implacable foe, the traditional and everlasting enemy of the blacks," unquote. The compelling reason for publicly putting this declaration in its historical context is made clear. the necessary re-education of blacks, and a possible solution of racial crisis can begin. Strangely enough, only when blacks fully realize this central fact in their lives, the white man is their bitter enemy. For this is not the ranting of wild-eyed militancy, but the calm and unmistakable verdict of several thousand years of documented history. Even the sample case study of 10 black states in this work shows that each and every one of those states was destroyed by whites. Facing this reality does not call for increasing hatred or screaming and utterly futile denunciations. Far from it. For all these shouting emotional outbursts by blacks are in themselves indications of weakness, because they becloud the mind and prevent the calm and clear thinking that is absolutely required for planning if the race is to be saved from final destruction. Destruction is not too strong a term here. Only fools will be unable to see that the race is again being hemmed in, surrounded by its enemies, and cannot survive forever under what might be called a state of gradual siege. Those Negroes who are still pleading with the whites for brotherhood through integration are so deaf and blind that they are unable to get the white enemy's reply to these frantic pleas for acceptance through integration. The reply of whites was so loud and clear that it was heard around the world. When segregation in schools and residencies was outlawed throughout the United States, whites fled from the cities to the suburbs just as though a plague had struck, or some deadly disease was spreading. The blacks were left alone in the cities, now called ghettos or the inner city. This was rejection, total, complete. The black youth of America got this message from the whites first, and they got it quickly. They formed new battle lines. Several millions of quote-unquote middle-class Negroes and their leaders have not received the message yet, and probably never will. For them, the white man is the ship, and all else is the sea. They themselves do not feel competent to develop the highest standards of life in the all-black communities created by the very whites they so much worship. For them, there can be no quality education unless, by hook or crook, some white faces, any kind of white faces, are in the classrooms. Their main drive is to force the fleeing whites to accept them, or, quote, "Please, O you superior people, allow us to bus some of our children to your schools." As they achieve these hollow victories on the integration front, they add a new cry. Give us racial balance. These Negroes have neither the ethnic pride nor the self-respect that is so characteristic of the American Indians, Japanese, and Chinese, and they seem utterly insensitive to being openly rejected by the whites, and battle on with the fantastic idea that they can force the whites to accept them socially. One major reason why young black America understood the white position so quickly was that by some happy circumstance in history, they were more closely attuned to the great common people and therefore shared their common aspirations and common sense. No one has to tell them that there can be no bigger farce than the integration of hated and oppressed blacks with the very white enemies who oppressed them. Both the farce of integration and the everlasting white enemy are regularly highlighted in the world's press. Race riots in integrated U.S. armies in Europe, and even at war in Indochina. Race riots in camps in USA. Race riots on battleships of integrated U.S. Navy, and, in short, open combat between blacks and whites when they are forced together as equals. There is peace and harmony, of course, when the blacks humbly stay in their place, their subordinate place. Using the courts to force whites to accept blacks as equals is quite futile, even when and if all the thousands of court battles are won. White America is overwhelmingly against integration, and white Americans are no different than other whites throughout the world. The only instance in their history when integration was welcomed were when the outcome would put them in a more dominating position, or one of personal security, money, and a prestige they could never otherwise achieve. Hence, because of the high premium many Negroes give to a white skin, the most ordinary whites will eagerly marry any black star or any other blacks, if they have money. But in no period in history, and this point is important, have the masses of blacks sought integration and general amalgamation with the whites. During all of their travails, their pride in race was steadfast. The so-called self-hatred actually reflects a sense of futility and despair over lack of leadership and unity for action. They, the black masses, rejected general integration as a movement to obliterate the black race as such. The black masses still reject it. I have pointed out blind alleys into which we are being led by leaders whose aims and objectives are quite personal and not those of the black masses. Footnote: no one should presume to say what the attitude of any large group of people is without learning what it is directly from the people concerned. Our study of viewpoints began in 1955. The survey started at Tuskegee with 52 school supervisors and principals, teachers, and graduate students from 12 states. They were to conduct polls from time to time in their respective states over a period of years. No formalities, no rush, just two simple questions. Do you want integration? 2. Why? For either yes or no. End of footnote. These black masses demand absolute equality on all fronts, precisely the same rights, privileges, and responsibilities as all other citizens, and without any exceptions whatsoever. This obviously includes the right of every individual to attend the school or college of his choice, rent or buy a home wherever he pleases, marry whom he pleases, white or black, and to freely use all places of public accommodation. All of which is a far, far cry from the doctrine that all of this must necessarily include a white presence to be valid, or a mass movement by the race toward amalgamation. The presence of whites in any given situation should be incidental, if considered at all. What the Negroes referred to above seem incapable of grasping is the difference between a good school and a white school, a good community in which to live and a white community. To them, they are necessarily the same, continuing evidence of the Caucasian success in capturing the mind of blacks. The motherland at the crossroads. The problem is essentially the same in our African homeland. There too, white is still the standard of excellence, of what is right, wise, and best. I personally know a number of African presidents and ministers who will not dare to make important decisions without the guidance of white advisors. Men who often know far less about the questions at hand than the presidents and their ministers, but they all feel the need for a white seal of approval. The blacks, therefore, still have a long way to go in order to achieve absolute equality as free men among free men. They have a long way to go in the United States and the numerous other areas in which they live all over the world. In Africa, at this writing, Tanzania leads in the first hard-headed, masses-oriented socio-economic program that is expressly designed to raise the level of life of the whole people, beginning with those lowest down. It is a truly African program, drawing heavily on African cultural traditions. It was from its very inception too much for those of the elite who think of independence as a mere transfer of power from a white ruling class to a black ruling upper class, leaving the masses no better off than they had been under colonialism. These are the kind of smug and cocksure leaders who are preparing the ground not for military coups, but mass uprisings such as Africa has not yet witnessed. The first line of action should center around the study and development of nationwide, people-involved, self-help cooperative programs, village by village, town by town, and block by block. Each community would do its own development planning, the government's principal role being to provide advisors, training, technical assistance, and loans when and where these are needed. For people with little or no money, barter and exchange are the first steps toward economic salvation, the basis for capital formation. Increased food production should be seen as for both wealth and health. The main emphasis would be inter-community relations between the various language groups in all development programs. This means agreement plans for each area to specialize in producing goods needed but not produced in the other regions. This is the direct route to national unity through cooperation in order to reach the goals desired in common by all language groups in each African state. This calls for thinking, planning, and hard work. Now it is just here within the race where integration is not only needed, but it is mandatory. We shall remain a weak people until we begin the drive for integration of blacks first of all, instead of battling to integrate with other peoples. The second great task of government leadership calls for furthering the home front economic development by aggressively working for African economic unity on a scale never before attempted. Interstate trade and other economic programs designed to deal with Asia and Europe must begin with unity of action in Africa itself, region by region, and then interregional or continental efforts. If black Africa is ever to free itself from the present economic morass. Nor will we be able to cover our failures by endlessly sweating and fuming over South Africa and Rhodesia. Black Africa can never deal effectively with white-ruled areas until it deals with Black Africa itself first. The foundation for everything we do or wish to do is economic. A word that simply means wealth enough to be really independent and having the means to do what must be done. If we have not noticed that every one of the great black nations studied rose as the result of a variety of wealth-producing activities which enabled them to achieve said goals, if we missed this fact, then we missed the most important lesson they left us in this book. Another significant fact was the widespread trade between the early African states. Somehow they overrode the communications barriers about which we now hear so much. The crying first need throughout the African world, however, is dedicated leaders, not just office-holding bureaucrats. Men and women leaders who will be more and more in the field among the people and less preoccupied in offices with paperwork. These will be people on a mission to improve the lives of the people, rather than enriching themselves. Meanwhile, a frustrated people send up a silent prayer, often heavy with tears. Please, O God, send us a few real leaders, just a few, Lord. Wanted, leaders and African ideologies. The black people of the world have therefore come at last to destiny's crossroads. They must make some fundamental decisions as a single people. The one hopeful sign is that they are slowly and painfully coming to their hitherto beclouded senses, coming to realize that they are one people with a common destiny, and that no matter how scattered over the world, the treatment suffered by one black group is suffered by all. But there is a terrible crisis of leadership at the crossroads. There is no united leadership group or any real effort to create one. The great difficulty is that black leaders, again, unlike the Jews, do not know what their own heritage is. They are almost wholly ignorant of their own cultural source from which independent, original thinking springs and progress is inspired. The Negro leaders who spearhead and carry on the campaigns for integration, amalgamation being the aim, not only do not know the great heritage of the blacks, they do not want to know it. They wish to draw on the Caucasian heritage and become identified with it. They are totally rejected by the whites, but no matter. They keep on trying because the white liberals do encourage them to hope by mixing with them from time to time. Other leaders, equally ignorant of their heritage, simply do not know which way to lead. They too feel compelled to adopt and follow Caucasian ideologies because they do not feel free, equal, and competent enough to develop an ideology of their own, an African-oriented ideology. Hence, many, including some black youth leaders from whom so much was expected, are jumping out of white capitalistic democracy's frying pan straight into white communism's fire. Neither system was designed for the black world, yet each is only too anxious to use the blacks as they have always been used, a numerical power base for white rule. Moreover, the capitalistic version of democracy and the Soviet version of communism not only could not serve the interest and aspirations of the blacks, but they do not serve the interest of the white masses. Neither of them. Of course, there would be a much larger class and a more powerful class of black commissars and black central committees if communism should spread over the black world, and more black capitalists if capitalism becomes the prevailing way of life. In each case, we have not a theory or a speculation, but a plain operating fact that even a fool can see. Both capitalism and communism have ruling classes that suppress and exploit the people. The masses of people, like so many masses of puppets, are fed and filled with the ideals and principles of both systems. For these they fight and die, screaming these ideals as though they were drugged. Voting creates an illusion of power that does not exist in fact. It works wonderfully well for the rulers, the real decision makers, because the people in capitalistic democracies actually believe they are deciding and running things. One surprising difference between capitalistic and communist countries is that the people in the latter countries know they are powerless. When the United States assumed the leadership role of holding the line of white Western power throughout the world, Russia took over a similar role for the white East European states. The hammer and sickle flag is different than the stars and stripes, but each now represents the same objective. Communism seeks to bring the various peoples of the world under the white supremacy of white communist states under Russian domination. Our capitalistic democracy aims at doing the same thing: white rule under American domination. Hence, the Cold War, which has nothing to do with communism itself. The so-called Cold War is in fact a contest between two of the strongest white powers for world domination. Because communism is not the real issue, as capitalism is not the real issue on the communist side, the United States will form alliances and give all-out aid and support to a communist country just as quickly, some say more quickly, as to a non-communist country. Anything to weaken not communism but Russia, the chief white challenge for world rule. As between these two giants, the choice of the blacks can only be a choice between two groups of white masters, although the yoke and shackles of one are attractively painted red. Nor will the blacks find their salvation in Mao's China or any third world in which they will still be in a subordinate position. To be equal, they must first stand on their own feet. In this capitalism versus communism connection, the immediate trouble confronting the blacks is that so many millions of them have been made so wholly dependent on the white race for so many generations that they have become mentally lazy. For these, dependence has become comfortable. It frees them from the initiative, responsibility, and planning required of independent free men and women. Leave it to the white folks has become their unspoken creed. They have not yet come to realize that this attitude of dependence by so many is responsible for the whole race being characterized as children and men being called boys. To be recognized as men, they seem not to know they must aggressively assume the role of men. And this is why so many black leaders expect the solution to the so-called race problem to be handed to them on the silver platters of white ideologies. This excuses them from both the mental task of working out their own and the labor required for actually carrying through a united action program, first nationwide and then worldwide. It is needless to say what elementary common sense dictates, which is that when the African people achieve enough unity to develop the ideological guidelines for their own advancement, they will draw what is best for them from any or all existing systems as a simple matter of course. For whatever an African organized way of life might be, they would not hesitate any more than Stalin and the Soviet leaders when they brought in capitalists from the United States, Germany, and England, not to adopt capitalism, but to learn those capitalistic skills, techniques, and methods which would be useful in building a great Soviet Union. The emerging communist states drew heavily on capitalism when it served their purpose, openly and without apology. Hence, they became equal with the greatest powers without changing their own ideology. These observations are addressed only to those who seem not to know that one may extract what he needs from capitalism and communism without becoming capitalist or communist. The Black Unity Threat. None seems to have noticed or understood the signals from the white world, signals which tell us how tremendously important the whites regard any movement toward unity among the blacks. Nothing racial seems to upset them more. That is why they insist on being in on any black organizational movement, either as financially supporting members or as advisors, observers, or reporters. To bar them from any exclusively all-black conference is regarded as something a little less than treason, or as some kind of black conspiracy in the making. On the other hand, no blacks are ever present at all-white conferences, where the fate of blacks everywhere is discussed and decided. Unity among the blacks has been prevented for so many centuries that the various mechanisms to keep blacks disorganized have been perfected in the Western system of race control. The white man is keenly aware of the tremendous power of any well-organized group, but an organization of blacks on a scope that would represent the voice of Black America would be a threat and a challenge not only to continued white domination of blacks in the United States, but also foreign policies and practices that affect the lives of African people elsewhere over the world. But the apprehension of whites about the possibility of real black unity appears to be quite as needless now as in the past. For we are still in the meeting and talking stage of our history, and appear not to be ready even to begin the attack on the obviously built-in obstacles. These have been pointed out over and over again in this study. They had to be emphasized and could not possibly be overemphasized, because in addition to the historic reasons for our own self-generated disunity, no other non-white people on earth are in the dangerous situation of having so many of their leaders selected, appointed, sponsored, or financed by the white ruling classes. In the case of blacks in the United States, and the same is true of blacks elsewhere, these Negro heads of important institutions and organizations represent the white man's indirect rule over the black community. It is the voice of these leaders that is accepted as the voice of the race. They do indeed have a great following, drawn almost entirely from the traditional Negro elite or upper middle class: lawyers, government officials, doctors, professors, school administrators, scientists, engineers, heads of integrationalist organizations, etc. They are essentially anti-black, anti-African, and therefore anti-black studies. Hence their frantic drive for integration, which of course will effectively check the alarming development of pride in a race, a sense of cultural identity with one's own bloodline, and a growing knowledge of being members of a race with a record of achievements unsurpassed by any other people. Despite the conversion of so much that was black to white, this the Negro leadership would destroy, even at its inception, by forcing the black youth of America more directly under white education, direction, and control. A vengeful striking back at black youth for starting revolt against their mental enslavement in the first place. In a panel discussion with 3 other university presidents, the head of one major white university said, quote, "Integration is a very misleading term. Our black students are as separate from the white students as they are in the general society, and they know it. They come because of the vast number of special scholarships offered to them. This is a wise program from our point of view. It brings more of the future black leaders into a more traditionally American environment. We are not disturbed by their demand for black studies, for these, of course, will be gradually phased out as their emotions cool." End quote. That same month, May 1971, a Negro professor declared, quote, "Black studies are ridiculous in any university. I am not black, and I will not join in this new hypocrisy. I am a Negro, yet outside the United States I am considered white." End quote. On a recent TV program, the head of a militant black movement went even further. In response to a question, he said, quote, "Look at me. I am neither black, Negro, nor African. I am a Moor. My roots are in Asia." He was born in Mississippi. But the moderator pressed, "You call your movement a black movement?" "Ah," the great Moorish leader replied, "that strategy," apparently satisfied that the black masses did not hear him, or if they did, would not understand. Quite relevant to all this, I have made several points above. One was that, notwithstanding the white man's well-developed system of maintaining disunity within the African race, he is still disturbed by any signs of a movement towards unity among blacks, and goes into action in many subtle ways to offset it. The important point is the most disheartening. This is the fact that the white man really has nothing to fear from any effective unity among blacks for a long, long time, because he himself installs and backs most of the key leaders of the race, 2 of which I have just quoted above, and the number is legion. We still have, in the 1970s, therefore, exactly the same unique problem that confronted Africans in Egypt over 6,000 years ago. And we challenge any student of history to point out any other people who are or have been saddled with a perpetually disunifying and progress-checking problem of this magnitude. For while the white man has mingled his blood with non-white peoples from times immemorial, in no other people was the outcome a hostile race within a race. No other non-white people with Caucasian blood, whether Indian, Japanese, or Chinese, feel any compelling reason for integration, a code word for amalgamation with the whites. Quite the contrary, they resist it as a policy or an acceptable general practice. The only hope for the kind of racial unity that will really liberate the blacks in America and command the respect of the world will be a new kind of mass organization on a scale with an action program never before attempted. This will require a new kind of leadership, a leadership with the single purpose of helping the masses up toward a better life. We are noted for our countless organizations, large and small. Each is an independent kingdom, struggling to become an empire under a great chief. This is inevitable in the circumstances, but, as in the history of Africa, not one of these standing alone can meet the mounting crisis of the race. If they will not unite, the race need not continue in despair because of the unyielding pride of individual leaders. A people's mass organization movement can override all obstacles, but will this be done? The subtitle of this book, Great Issues of a Race, from 4500 BC to 2000 AD, has puzzled some readers. 2000 AD, that is the end of this century, and we are not there yet. This subtitle, however, not only reflects the author's conviction that the main obstacles which confronted us in the past and are with us today will still be with us in the year 2000 and after, but also that for the rest of this century it is very likely that the blacks will still be meeting, listening to, and applauding fiery, soul-stirring speeches, protesting and denouncing injustices, or happily relying on politics as the ultimate solution of our problems. The frustrations, confusion of goals, and a sense of helplessness are likely to continue into the next century. What black youth began as the foundation for a new and mighty advance may be, and indeed is being, defeated. But whether the task of what must be done is undertaken by this generation or left to the next, one thing is certain. It can never be said again that the black race does not know exactly what to do, or that not a single member of the race ever carefully studied and then presented a comprehensive plan as one way out. For the final pages of this work offer such a plan. It is not the plan, but a plan, a comprehensive basis for beginning and improving. But beginning.